The game Lisa is the best game ever made. Lisa is actually a pair of games and an expansion for one of those games. In truth, the Lisa game is a series, but I consider it a single game that must be experienced in its entirety chronologically so that it can be understood properly and wholly. Lisa is a game about parenthood, in particular fatherhood. It is a game about the effect of child abuse, of sexual abuse, of incestuous sexual violence from a father onto his daughter, of physical and psychological violence from a father onto his children. It is a game about addiction to substances, about depression, about childhood. At the core of the game's themes lie two things: rape and incest. A misled and malicious NGO has recently abused the fact that a couple companies hold a monopoly over payment processing to instigate a mass removal of all games on Steam that feature the rape and incest tags. That particular NGO wants all those games to disappear. It would appear as though if the Lisa game were to find itself tagged with the rape and incest tags, which I would argue are appropriate, given just how vital to the game they are, then it would also be made to disappear. It is important to note that the tags attached to Steam games are defined by users. That means there is room for error, as there is room for misuse. Thus, it is possible that a big enough conglomerate of individuals, or a bot farm with malicious intent, can collectively apply a new tag to a game, such as rape or incest, and have it removed. That would be very unfortunate. But I would argue it is more important to note that the aforementioned NGO is, as previously stated, abusing monopolies. It is wielding corporate interest. It is well known that corporations, whenever financially threatened, do not take the time to address the nuance and do not go in depth. Thus, there will be no moderation, and everything will be stricken down. Then there is the matter of what the NGO is supposedly fighting against: the sexualization of women and girls in general, and in particular the very existence of pornography. In this case, pornographic games on Steam that feature the tags incest and rape. Their arguments: protect the children. There is a very simple way of protecting children, far simpler and far more effective than banning games off a platform. It is called conscientious parenting. Good parenting, even. In their arguments as to why what they're doing is good, they present a counter-argument against the argument that one can simply be a good parent. And that counter-argument is that other parents are not going to be good parents. They beat bad parenting with bad parenting. In other words, they say that there is a problem, and instead of solving the problem, they go on to address the consequences of that problem. There is a very real theme here. They may or may not mention that there is a problem, but instead of addressing the problem, this NGO goes on to whine about the consequences of that problem. Instead of campaigning for the development of social safety nets, for raising the minimum wage, for improving working conditions throughout the world, this NGO complains about sex work, while admitting that sex work takes advantage of underprivileged women. It is exceedingly intriguing that instead of trying to solve the main issue, which would also solve a nearly limitless number of other issues, this NGO goes after offshoots of that issue, which will, instead of making life better for everyone affected, make life worse for roughly 60% of the people involved in the industry, because through the employment and opportunity provided by sex work, these underprivileged women have access to income. Naturally, there is misuse and abuse. Trafficking is rampant, but why is it rampant? Instead of taking the time to address the fact that crime booms in spaces stricken with poverty, and within the umbrella of which falls sexual trafficking, and taking the time to address the cause for poverty, this NGO is whining about a single aspect of a greater issue, which aspect, even if completely eradicated, will not solve the problem. In fact, it will only make things worse for those affected, because a possible avenue for sustenance and maybe even escaping poverty will be destroyed. Again, instead of fighting for the promotion of trade unions, for the increase of minimum wage, for strengthening of regulations on employers, for the institution of labor laws that care for the worker, instead of fighting against the entities that make poverty possible and profit off of it, they make use of said entities. They bow their heads to said entities and lap at their feet. The NGO in question makes gratuitous use of LLMs. The NGO in question, as mentioned, relies on monopolies to push its agenda. Simply put, it is evident that this NGO is at the very least misled and incapable of tackling the issues that ought to be tackled, or, at worst, a hand puppet for the engines driving the things they are fighting against. Lastly, by initiating a mass ban on a certain type of media and conflating sex and sexploitation, regardless of the flimsy argument attempted by Gail Dines, this NGO sets the precedent for further restriction of content that may or may not be unappealing for certain ideologues, much like it is unappealing for the folks at this NGO who are clearly adherents to a certain ideology that does not or cannot address the actual issue that causes the thing they claim to have a problem with. In a slippery slope reminiscent of what that splendid little poem that concludes with the claim that when they came for me, there was no one to stand up for me entails. In the current political climate, it is exceedingly obvious that if such precedent is set, we can and should expect to see anything relating to the Middle East and genocide in the world of gaming be banned, for there are countless NGOs that will jump at the opportunity to do so. There are also countless other entities that will violently pounce upon games tagged as anti-capitalist. What will be left? Gacha slop, probably. In conclusion, I'm not a fan of hypocritical NGOs engaging in censorious activity and claiming that they are working to solve an issue when, in reality, they are not doing that. Also, sex work is real work, no matter what form it takes. Even more so, fictional people are fictional, and humanity is intelligent enough to be able to tell fiction from reality. If certain NGOs are of the opinion that that is not the case, well, then the issue is not in the fiction, it is in the education of those engaging with the fiction.